Okay, well, let's do
All right.
that. I'll get started. Well, once again, thank you all so much for having me. My name is James Verzuh. I'm an archaeological technician on the Helena-Lewis and Clark National Forest. That means I'm a seasonal technician and I support the forest archaeology. Today, I'm going to go over the site monitoring process as it pertains to Forest Service archaeology and give you a little bit of insight into it. So, as you said, my background is working for the University of Montana. I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology. My focus was in archaeology. Let's see if I can
Go ahead.
jump to the next slide.
Jump to the next one. You can go ahead.
Jen?
Yeah.
And the computer go in front of him so they can see him talking instead of his back. What they see is his back, do they not? Or
They'll see-
they're gonna see that, okay.
They're going to see that.
Okay.
Well, so archaeology is a study of material culture. We study the things people leave behind in order to better understand them. I like to use this as an example. Someday, the archaeologist who excavates my house will learn a lot about me by looking at this energy drink can. So one of the important things on this slide is the 50-year standard. Now, there's some talk amongst, I'm going to move to the other side, the archaeological community on moving that date back or around. But for now, 50 years is when we decide that, or agree, that's when something enters the archaeological record. We have for Forest Service archaeology, we look at two eras. We have pre-contact or prehistory, which is pretty much everything before Lewis and Clark, and then historic, which is everything from the core discovery on. Also, the number one thing I get when I talk to people about archaeology and I tell them I'm an archaeologist, is like, oh, I love dinosaurs. Well, I like dinosaurs too. The archaeologists don't study dinosaurs, but we got some fantastic exhibits of them over in Bozeman. Perfect. So what does an archaeologist do for the Forest Service? Well, the short answer is that the archaeologists are employed to meet federal standards, support the forest mission, and fulfill our obligation to the public, the tribes, and the past. On the civil federal standards related to archaeology, these laws make up the bulk of our work and provide the framework for managing known sites or how we interact with new sites. Some of these laws obligate us to work with the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, public groups, and some are more about preserving America's history for future generations. So these are some of the specific tasks a forest archaeologist might do. This isn't a comprehensive list, but it gives you an idea of what's expected from me and archaeologists all the way up to my boss. So here are some, for prehistoric or pre-contact, we're especially lucky on the forest to have just a wealth of resources. We have lithics, which is all kinds of stone tools. If you've lived in Montana a while, you've probably come across an arrowhead. That'll fall under that heading. A rock art, most famously by the Gates of the Mountains, you've probably seen from the water. Kilns, high altitude rock alignments. Jen Ryan, the archaeologist out of Helena, is working on a big project with those. Of course, rock shelters, again, quite common. For historics, we're just as lucky. Mining is a huge part of early Montana history. We have a wealth of resources around it on the forest. Mines themselves, mining towns, kilns. We have a lot of historic buildings. Remember, anything 50 years older count as part of the archaeological record. So that even includes Cold War sites. That includes the Indian Wars. That includes the early Forest Service history. In fact, for this forest specifically, we really have all areas of Montana historics represented on the forest. So something that was impressed upon me on my first archaeology class back in 2013 was a sense of archaeological ethics. You know, it's important to keep in mind the real people who came before us, whose land we're on, possessions we're interpreting. Every rock shelter or cabin is where someone lived. Every mine is where someone worked. Every lithic was someone's tool. And we owe it to these people to tell their stories as accurately as possible. And that leads me right into today's specific topic, the Jimtown Cemetery. So one of my things I love about the Forest Service is a lot of times I get jobs like this. In this case, the Forest Service has done a land exchange with a private entity. And so formerly private land has fallen to public as now part of the National Forest. In this case, there was a known site on the area. This site was a grave site that was well known and shown on maps for a long time, but because it was on private land, no one had been out to monitor it in over 20 years. So I get to monitor the site. Myself and my counterpart in Helena, Kai, will conduct a site visit, prepare either site monitoring form or site form update, depending on how significant our findings are. But before I can go out to the field, there's a few things I need to do to get ready. The place to start when I'm monitoring a known site is to look at the previous site forms. The oldest form for this site goes back to 1977 and is unfortunately indicative of a lot of site forms at the time. It's handwritten. It's only a couple paragraphs about their techniques, what they found, their observations, their analysis. The only map is a sketch map drawn by hand, and it references photos that aren't in the file anymore. Like I said, this is unfortunately common at the time, but they did have an interpretation of the site. This archaeologist looked, and they looked at the site itself, and they asked around, and they came to the interpretation that this was a grave of a settler's wife who passed away on the trail going west and was buried here in a lone grave. The only other monitoring was in 2000, and by this time the site itself was on private land, so the archaeologists could only observe it from over a fence, quite literally. They were hampered in this. In this way, they missed some of the other parts, such as the other graves in the area, and they I think defaulted to the previous archaeologist's interpretation. One of the other takeaways of this is knowing that this was the state of the site forms. I already know I'm going to have to do a site form update. This is essentially a rewrite of the site form. It's not a replacement, so we don't get rid of the old thing, but it does add a lot more information and a new interpretation if I have it. So some background research has already been done for me when I took him on the assignment. Then information used a website you guys might know of called Find a Grave. This information had this site had a lot of information from what looked like a private individual doing amateur archaeology. Their interpretation, however, was that the here was a placer miner who had committed suicide. They lived in a cabin nearby. We also had an email chain that supported this interpretation, and that also stated that the miner's Native American wife and child were buried nearby, and that a fire in the 1920s had burned away the other wooden headboards at the cemetery. As before, this conclusion seemed to have been reached with archaeological techniques. So the problem here was that I had two sources of information, two conflicting interpretations of the site. I'll need to keep both of these in mind when I go out to the site, but I want to be able to let the site tell me the information and not lean towards whichever one of these I prefer. In preparing for a site visit, I almost always make a map. This is done digitally in a program called ArcGIS, and specifically ArcMap or ArcPro. What the program allows me to do is bring in site imagery, like satellite imagery, layers, some other maps, points, polygons, and build the map however I need it for the site. And in this case, I'll make a map that'll show the site and kind of some of the surrounding areas, and then I'll load it onto my phone. Avenza is one of several mapping apps that allows me to load digital maps right onto my phone. And so I can plug it in there, and then while I'm in the field, I'll be able to see exactly where I'm standing and take new points, new lines, new polygons. This is an example of all the gear I take to the field. Basically, if I need the gear to get to the site, to get there safely, or to fully record the site, it goes in the bag. Some things will come out and go in as the season goes on, but basically everything that goes in May will stay in there until March. So heading into the field, it's easily my favorite part of the process. Unfortunately, it's also the quickest. When you're going out to observe a site like this, usually you only need to be out there for a day. We like to say that for every day in the field, spend 3 days in the office or lab, and that tends to be true. The most important things I can do in the field, though, are these three: to make observations, take lots of photos, and obtain new geometry. And of these three, easily the most important is making observations. So I want to look at how did I get to the site? What's the condition of the site? What's the condition in relation to the previous site form? Are there any animals around, plants? What's around the site physically, any buildings, anything I noticed on the side, anything that seems different or worth writing down, the elevation. You can't get enough information because you don't know what you might need later on those 3 days in the office. So what did we see when we went out there? Kai and I went out and looked, and the first thing is we noticed a ton of details that weren't recorded in the other site forms. The biggest one was that the pit or hall engraved had 2 markers in front of it. We also observed an additional burial plot, that the previous jackleg border fence and land exchange runs along or possibly into the site itself. The headstone had an approximate age engraved instead of a concrete one. And that there were several placer mining trenches in the area. These were on both sides, but stopped about the same distance from the actual grave site itself. They very clearly were avoiding it.
And a few years ago, she was writing a story about how people will buy around
on a shelf with a beautiful view into the surrounding valley and mountains. So these are all important ways important things to know about the site that change our interpretation, change our understanding. So it's important that we have it in the site form. At the time, we theorized this headstone you see in the picture was a modern addition, and that the marker you see here on the next slide was the original headstone. We came to this conclusion because it looked much older. And the headstone with the name on it was in just better shape. We were aware of it historically. But while I was walking around, I could see from a recent fire, which we found out later had burned in the area in 2007. So we looked at this like, all right, this makes sense. This was the original one, and then they've added this other one. What we didn't find was any evidence of structure or any surface.
The first human being to achieve what only computers
Couple
have.
other.
Well, congratulations. You're very good.
Good idea. See, there's
Two of my favorite.
the marker.
Right now, you have control of the vortex. Austin does not. Choose a category.
We're learning.
Now, as a comparison, we went to the nearby York Cemetery, which is historic as well, and they had graves that were from around the same time as this headstone. So we were able to observe what graves there looked like, and found out it wasn't headstones so much as wood boards or headboards that had been engraved. And so that also helped us understand, like, all right, maybe there was a graves here that the boards got burned over in the historic fire. The last thing we did out there was record new geometry. Again, we wouldn't do this at every site, but we looked at the site form previously. We went out and we looked in the field, and we can tell we're going to need to update the site completely. So we'll record new geometry. Again, it's as easy as I go out, I center myself on the map, and I hit to take a new point. And then when I get back to the office, I can load the same data onto my computer and use it to draw the map. We really prefer when we make it to do polygons because they're easier to work with in our national system. It's easier to buffer them. If there's construction work, it's easier to just show them on a big map rather than just a collection of dots when I'm explaining it at a fire camp. So now that we've gone to the field, we've made our observations, we've taken new photos, we've got new geometry, it's time to write the report. At this point, though, I didn't really feel confident in going with either interpretation or a new one of our own. So I think instead we need to do more research before we make the final maps and prepare the final set forms. The work that I looked at, I hadn't looked like yet. Well, there are a few options, and Kai took the lead here with talking to some of the locals. Just like the archaeologists before us had come, he reached out to some people in the area. Consistently, I find across all the forts I've worked on, talk to people who live in the area, a lot of times know about it, a lot of times they care about what's around there, and they're happy to share it with you. So in this case, Kai reached out some of the people living around New York and asked them about Jimtown Cemetery. Unfortunately, in this case, nobody had any specific information about the grave site, but they did know we're able to correct some misconceptions that were in the historic records. We also looked into some of the site forms for local sites that were from around the same time. Again, they provided context, but nothing that changed our understanding of the site.
And it says you also looked at the veteran and census records.
That's correct. Yeah. So we looked at the time, the rough time Peter Holland would have been around, which was coming off. He would have been the appropriate age for the Civil War. And I also looked at let's then go back to it. So I'll get to why I know this, but this is very similar to military headstones at the time too.
Yeah.
So we looked into veteran and census records. Unfortunately, nothing specific came out. For census records, we did find Holland's, but they only show up in Montana well after this individual had passed away. So the next place I looked was the Bureau of Land Management, GLO, or General Land Office records. These are often very helpful. Provide a wealth of information. You can look anywhere and pretty self-explanatory on how to use it. In this case, we ran into two problems. One was that this area was originally part of Marr County when they were there instead of Lewis and Clark. So some of the records, I think, got jumbled that way. But just like I said with the census records, when I look up Holland, the only Hollands I found were from the 1930s on. So we'd have to check somewhere else. So now I think to myself, I'm not an expert in cemeteries, but maybe I should talk to one. So I went out to the Mount Olivet Cemetery in town, speak with Eric Sprague, the office manager there, and he was a fantastic resource. I had a whole list of questions about, what does this look like? What would be the layout be? How close would graves be together? And he had answers for all of them. He is managing a modern cemetery, and this is the historic one, but he was still able to provide a lot of insight. The most important thing he said was that this marker we found that we thought was maybe the original one, he looked at that and he said, well, that's the same kind of markers we use to mark a plot when someone buys one in advance. And it was likely at the foot of the grave. He looked at the headstone and he said, no, I think that is the original based off some materials. And those same materials that if there wasn't any fire scarring on it, well, they would have been washed off by the rain. So this was a huge find that, again, we'd come to this interpretation and we'd done some more research and I was like, no, that's completely wrong. Talking as an expert should never be underestimated, and it's another tool I keep in the toolbox. The single most useful thing, though, to this site was newspaper records. With newspaper records, at least from my side, looking at it, sometimes you get very lucky in this case, and sometimes you find very little. But in this case, it changed everything about it. We found that Peter had lived in a cabin near his claim in the cemetery. His claim was active at the time of his death, and that his death wasn't a suicide, but he died of natural causes, probably a stroke. One of the other things I like, and you can't see it as well on here, but let's see if I can move these around a little bit to show you. Yeah. So this came from a website here, but it's got the name of the place, it's got the date, it's got everything I need to cite it. So when I go to say, make it seem like, hey, no, he did die of natural causes, I can back it up with something very concrete. It's just as important. So click through these slowly so you guys take a look at some of the other clip-ins we found.
So he appeared in at least 2 newspapers?
I think 3 across a couple articles.
Okay.
Pull back one for you.
Nice one. Yeah, we're pretty familiar with newspapers.com.
The overall findings, what we found out about the site changed our understanding dramatically. We didn't find answers to everything at the site, but what we learned is incredibly valuable. Peter Holland was not a settler's wife. He did not kill himself. He ran a mining claim, was still producing when he passed away. He may have purchased his plot in advance. He may have had input on the headstone. He very likely lived nearby, and it's possible he had a wife and child who were buried nearby, but we didn't find any evidence of this. I don't think this means that the previous information was wrong. It's I have every reason to have faith in the archaeologists in the 70s. So it's very possible that they went out and they talked to somebody and that there is another grave out there that we didn't locate that has this individual buried at it.
Has anyone used LiDAR?
We were looking in to see, so we haven't looked at, we're not wearing this phone, but I was just talking to Kai and Hana today, and I was thinking about these fires, if there's any chance they flew some imagery in the area, we might be able to use. So we're looking in to try to get some of that. Sometimes you do find it from even fires a few years ago, sometimes you can't. The original site form identified the site as a lone grave and wondered why this individual was not buried at the York Cemetery nearby. But now we know that this is because this is a cemetery and it's not a lone grave at all. Knowing this isn't just good for the site, but contributes to our understanding of Jimtown as a town itself. With the marker there, with the way that the mining features avoid the cemetery, I think there's a good chance the cemetery was managed. And then means that Jimtown was big enough and busy enough that it had somebody out here managing the cemetery. When looking through the newspaper records, I did find a listing of another burial at the town, which means that the other grave plot we found could have been that individual, could have been someone completely different, could have been this wife of the settler. The mine around the site was extensive, and there was also, like I said earlier, there's evidence from the past fires. Both these things were absent from the previous site forms. They both could have impacted the site negatively, and so they do need to be recorded on the site form. It's an important thing we get that onto there. So the final maps, all the points, the lines, the polygons, everything I took, any locational data, occasionally photos, will all put back into a final map. This map's, I'll create a 1 to 24,000 map and an imagery map, and then I'll use these, label these, and then they'll go into the our national resource management database. So all the archaeologists around the United States can be looking at it through the Forest Service. So this is especially relevant when it comes time to project work. Something I think about is setting the people who come after me archaeologically up for success. So in 10 to 40 years, there might be a fire, or I want to do a timber harvest in the area. Well, if I've done my map, so I'd set up good polygons, they'll be able to pull up those and see like, oh, there's a site here. And even though they don't have my experience of going down and looking at the site, doing this research, they can immediately let people know, hey, we need to avoid this, or hey, we got to, bring the dozer around this way to save this. The work's not quite done though. The updated site form needs to be sent to the state office along with the new geometry. If this was a brand new site, this is when I'd request the Smithsonian number from the state. If I believe this site had a tribal component, or if I believe that there would be a tribal interest, I'd reach out to the relevant tribal historic preservation office as well. The state office will concur or not with my evaluation on the site. And then if they do concur, that concurrence will be recorded. The new site form will be stored in physical and electronic forms at the relevant supervisor's office, in this case in Helena. And then if we designate this a priority asset, someone will be out here every 5 years to look at it. If not, just as situations allow. Going forward, the forms used, like I said, anytime anything could negatively impact the site. So archaeology is the interpretation of the past through material culture, but I hope I've shown tonight that involves a lot more than just looking at the site. The archaeologist who first looked at the site in the 70s was following professional standards, but they settled on an interpretation too quickly. The archaeologist in 2000 was hampered by not having access to the site and going off the interpretation from the previous archaeologist. Even from all that was learned about this site, there are still questions left unanswered, and I'm going to make sure the site form reflects that. As I said earlier, we need to set the archaeologist who looks at the site in 10, 20, 100 years up for success. We have an obligation to people like Peter to tell their stories as accurately as possible. And a good way to do that archaeologically is to approach the site with different techniques, strategies, and theories. Thank you for your time. Oh, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you want to have anything.
Would you ever use ground penetrating radar to find more graves if there's more than possibly 2 or 3? Or...
So with the Forest Service, that's a big ask.
Okay.
Archaeologically, a lot of times it goes down to if we have like a very good reason.
Okay.
So this one, yeah, I looked at, we can see this headstone here, and then we surveyed around and we can see like, yeah, we're pretty sure this other spot here is a burial plot, but it would depend on if there was a need. And then also this is where we get into bringing other groups that might have a vested interest in who's buried there before we start doing that. Yes.
So I don't know where Jim County is. I know you said Lewis and Clark. And you're working kind of out of Helena.
Yeah.
So it's like north of.
So I can't give you the exact location, but it is north of Helena a little bit. I'm sorry. So a while ago, the Helena and Lewis and Clark forest merged. So we have 2 offices. I'm out of the Great Falls office, but I'm down to Helena every other week, it feels like.
Have you been working at Miners Gulch at all? The one here in Cascade County?
So I haven't, but some of my colleagues have. Yeah, they've been very lucky.
Yeah, I've been there, but I'm sure there's a lot more graves than I saw.
This lady's done probably over 50,000 photographs out of Find My Grave.
No kidding.
My grave.
Well, was this one of yours?
No. Must be great people, not just, but.
Very cool. Last year I wasn't last summer we had the fires up around Showdown. And some of my colleagues were out there trying to wrap and put in protection around the historic cemeteries at Monarch and Nyhart. And one of the things they ended up doing was dropping some trees in the way just to really make sure, and the fires never got that close, but we wanted to make sure we preserved what was there. Yes.
How significant is a site like this? If there's a fire or something, and you need a bulldozer, need to put a fire line, would they work around it and protect that?
So we never do any action that would put someone in danger. There was last year there was a new site I was recording, and there was a boss came by and said, "Hey, I need to build a safety zone, or do you need me to do this first?" I said, "Build your safety zone first. That's your priority. Is life. The people are there. Something like this, it's very important to me, and I'd advise it. But on a fire, I'm only an advisor. I can't tell people you will or you will not do something. I only advise.
I know Marysville was fortunate to with their cemetery 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they were fortunate enough to have a group come through and do the ground penetrating. So they were able to name all kinds of people and to see all of the unmarked graves there. And you might stop in at some point and see the lady. She's there on Sunday afternoons in the summer. And she had some pretty interesting material from it. Whoever did that, and they were doing it to actually begin to work with some new equipment. They had quite a crew, and they were there for a while. So
Wow.
yeah, it's so close to York, so close. Well, I mean, relatively.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So if there's a historical site that's on private land,
Mhm.
there's really nothing you can do about it?
In the United States, without getting specifically into the reading of the law, if you own land and there's an archaeological site on it, that's your property. Since I'm working for the federal government on the national forest, everything is public property, and so we're trying to maintain it that way for the public, for public, well, I guess kind of like I hit on earlier, for the benefit of future generations of American history.
What's your percentage when you attempt, if you see a site on a public or a property that's owned by somebody, what's the percentage of them letting you do the site?
We get a lot of good, usually people are very cooperative, but there's so much work to be done that I kind of I'm obligated to focus on our stuff. What happens a lot is we'll be on a fire and it'll switch onto a ranch, or we'll come across something, or a ranch hand will be like, oh yeah, I found a bunch of rock art over there. That's something you'd be interested in. And at that point, we move into like an educate mode. And so we just try to educate about them and encourage them to steward the site or as best they can. Yeah, if the opportunity arises, we definitely try to record it. But we have to give priority to the stuff that is on federal land.
So graffiti done today in 50 years, if it's still there, then it's.
Isn't it amazing?
historical.
Isn't that amazing? Has if anyone's been on the River's Edge Trail lately and they're walking east towards the interpretive center, you can look up and you see a little smiley face on there. And last time I was out jogging, I was like, something, that is rock art, and that is a representation of the current culture here. And we only got to wait another 49 years. That'll be on. There is talk professionally, like, maybe we should move the state around because 50 years isn't as old as it used to be. But for now, we all agree on 50 years, and that's what we stick with.
So when Lewis and Clark carved their names in the rock, it was graffiti, but later on it's historical.
I suppose so. With that one, if you ever get the chance, and I think the winter's the best time to do it, you get out to the Buffalo Jump. There's a lot of carvings and rock art in the bottom of it. But you do have to go out in the winter because of rattlesnakes.
So we're all historic here apparently.
Just thinking, I don't got that much longer to go myself. All right, well, I'll step out of the way. Again, thank you guys so much for having me.
Let's take just 5 minutes, since people I know that are online. If you wouldn't mind, people, we're gonna take just 5 minutes